Welcome to Unlocking the Dream Vision. I am your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. In this video series, we will be exploring the mysterious dream vision of Enoch as explored in my book, Unlocking the Dream Vision, The Secret History of Creation. In this video, we will take our first look at the monsters of legend. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and don't forget to subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one, to the many mysteries we will explore. We have finally reached a point where we can begin to truly see how all the little pieces of the puzzle of the mystical symbolism come together into one picture that will allow us to begin understanding the deeper meaning of the mystical symbolism of the dream vision and the secret history of creation that it holds. The key to understanding the real importance of the mystical symbolism and its use is an event that we've already touched upon, the destruction of the mighty abode of the gods, the heaven. Next to the fall of the Watchers, this is the single most important event in all of human history, but it also is one of the most misunderstood of all time. One of the primary reasons for this is the fact that everyone for the last 2,000 years have been taught to believe that the terrible, fiery destruction of the end times is yet to happen. As we have begun learning in the last video, the reason for this great destruction of the heaven was because of a small ragtag group of individuals that was led by the Lord of Light and even possibly with the help of the Goddess faction that infiltrated and damaged this mighty ship. This is the reason why the lambs were born among the white sheep. It was to send the message of how the world as they knew it was coming to an end, which was due to the oncoming destruction of the heaven, and the message that the Lord God faction could only save a small number of true believers. They were also told that because of this great oncoming destruction of the heaven, that their world was coming to a complete and total end. This is the event that allows us to sync up the dream vision back up with the biblical text. It also brings us to a unique point within the dream vision, a point where the dream vision has been clearly edited and at least 3 verses have been completely removed from the text. Not only have they been removed from the text, but they've been replaced with what appears to be doubled verses that have been slightly altered to appear to be part of the story. It's also possible that the double verses were not actually doubled, but these were actually longer verses that were broken into three additional pieces. Either way, there's enough information contained within the remaining verses to allow us to partially reconstruct the 3 missing verses of the dream vision. Using the Book of Revelations as our guide, we can also place these 3 doubled verses into their proper order. As you will soon see, these three verses that were removed with the 3 remaining verses were either doubled or broken into 2 parts to replace the 3 removed verses. In addition, they appear that they were placed in the wrong order. To begin understanding this unique change, we will first have to examine the original and double verses of the dream vision grouped together. Then we will begin to explore how they tie into the Book of Revelations. And I saw till the shepherds and eagles and those vultures and kites came, and they cried to the ravens that they should break the horn of that ram, and they battled and fought with it, and they battled with it, and they cried that its help might come. Book of Enoch, chapter 90, verse 13. All the eagles and vultures and ravens and kites gathered together and brought with them all the wild sheep, and they all came together and helped one another in order to dash that horn of the ram to pieces. Book of Enoch, chapter 90, verse 16. And I saw till that man who wrote down the names of the shepherds carried up into the presence of the Lord of the sheep, and came and helped it and showed it everything. He had come down for the help of that ram. Book of Enoch, chapter 90, verse 14. And I looked at that man who wrote the book at the command of the Lord until he opened that book of the destruction that those last 12 shepherds had wrought. And he showed in front of the Lord of the sheep that they had destroyed even more than those before them had. Book of Enoch, chapter 90, verse 17. And I saw till the Lord of the sheep came unto them in wrath, and all who saw him fled, and they fell unto his shadow from before his face. Book of Enoch, chapter 90, verse 15. And I looked until the Lord of the sheep came to them and took the staff of his anger and struck the earth, and the earth was split, and all the animals, all the birds of the sky, fell from those sheep and sank in the earth, and it closed over them. Book of Enoch, chapter 90, verse 18. Now, it may not seem obvious to you at this moment, but the last two verses, verse 15 and 18, are actually speaking of the mysterious star that fell from heaven, burning as if it was a lamp, a star that's remembered as wormwood in chapter 8 of the book of Revelations. This is the great destruction that came from the sky that could not be stopped by the gods. This is the mighty abode of the host of heaven. The ship that I've been referring to is the heaven. This is the starting point for this part of the story. It also allows us to use the first 7 chapters of the book of Revelations as a guide to help us through the missing verses of the dream vision. We will also take a final look at the ancient cylinder seals that reveal the true secret and importance of not just the monsters, but also the Pleiades cluster of stars. One final note, we will be covering a number of different aspects that will bring together several of the different mystical symbolic elements that we've covered up to this point. You'll also be presented with a large amount of information that may be difficult for you to take in the first time around. Because of this, I've broken the original chapter of the book into 2 separate videos. Here, one, the monsters of legends, and in the next video we will explore the Pleiades clusters and the secret that it holds. One final note, we will be covering a number of different aspects that will bring together several different mystical symbolic elements that we've covered up to this point. You will start to be presented with a large amount of information that can be difficult for you to take in the first time around. Because of these reasons, this entire section is presented from the perspective that you, the viewer, are familiar with or have a copy of the Book of Revelations from the King James Version of the Bible available for reference. But don't worry, I'll add those links below. We begin our journey with the first 3 chapters of the Book of Revelations, where we are told that a man named John, who is remembered in the biblical text as St. John the Divine, who is said to have had a vision of the resurrected Lamb, believed to be Jesus Christ. John is then instructed by the Lamb to write 7 letters to the 7 angels of the 7 churches of Asia. These 7 churches are then symbolically represented in the Book of Revelations as the 7 golden candlesticks. With our new knowledge of the mystical symbolism, we can understand the deeper symbolic meaning of these 7 golden candlesticks with the realization that they are a highly symbolic representation of the towers that the gods once stood upon. We can also begin to understand that the 7 angels of the 7 churches must be referring to the 7 shepherds. Based on the information from the dream vision on the periods of time that each shepherd pastured the sheep, we can understand that this is symbolically referring to the last 7 shepherds of the last 12 shepherds that had destroyed even more than those before them had. Based on the 52-year cycle we've examined, this would mean that these last events of the Book of Revelations cover approximately the last 364 years of the story. In chapter 4 of the Book of Revelations, we are told that after John writes the 7 letters to the 7 angels, or shepherds, that stood upon the 7 different towers of Asia, John is then taken away from the earth to the throne of God in heaven. Just like Enoch before him, John refers in his 2nd verse of chapter 4 that immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, the throne was set in heaven, and one sat on that throne. This I was in the Spirit is a familiar reference within the biblical account when someone is taken up onto heaven from the earth. With our new understanding that our Cro-Magnon man ancestors were incapable of mentally comprehending the advanced technology, also combined with our heretical knowledge that the gods our ancient ancestors worshipped were actually the highly advanced flying vehicles or craft. We can begin realizing that this "I was in the spirit" must be referring to a type of small transport ship that could at least enter low Earth orbit. This radically changes the interpretation that anybody has ever thought of before about this phrase. We will go into it a little bit more later on. We are then told that John sees 24 elders and 7 burning lamps, who were the 7 spirits of God, and that he saw 4 great and terrible beasts, all standing before the throne, all standing upon what John describes a sea of glass like unto crystal. These 24 elders that stand before the one on the throne upon this sea of like unto crystal have been quite a mystery for those who have studied the Bible, both expert and laymen alike. They are in fact much like the shepherds in this regard. But just like the shepherds, there's another legend from a largely unrelated culture that is still famous and well known today that helps provide the key to understanding who these 24 elders are. The legend that allows us to identify who these 24 elders are provides another example of how the mystical symbolism cuts across all the ancient cultures and stories of the world. The legend of which I speak is the ever-famous legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. This may seem a bit odd at this moment, and you might not be able to see the symbolic connections at first, but once again, this is another example of how the mystical symbolism cuts across all the ancient mythologies of the world. In order to begin understanding how this unrelated legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table is actually speaking of the 24 elders that stood before the throne of God in the Book of Revelations, we must first realize that the entire legend of King Arthur is a mythical, symbolic, and allegorical retelling of the political events of the gods we've already been examining. Once you can realize that the legend of King Arthur is a symbolic and allegorical retelling of one small part of the overall story, as we learned with the dream vision and the text of the Bible, you can begin to make the proper symbolic substitution for the different characters within the story. In this case, you will also learn how this is done to provide a much clearer understanding of the whole process using the mystical symbolism to unlock seemingly unrelated myths from different cultures. This can only be accomplished if you already have a basic understanding of the overall events of the story and its connection to the mystical symbolism itself. In the case of the legend of King Arthur, this is the next step in understanding how to use the symbolism and how it is so easily hidden. If we take a closer look at the legend of King Arthur and our new knowledge of the political situation between the 3 different god factions and apply it to this legend, we will gain a new understanding of the entire situation of the gods. We begin with realizing that the 3 primary characters of the legend of King Arthur, his wife Guinevere, and his closest friend and greatest knight, Sir Lancelot, represent the 3 primary god factions we've already been exploring. King Arthur is of course a symbolic human embodiment of the Lord God faction, or God of the Bible. Guinevere symbolically represents the goddess faction, with the great knight Lancelot representing the great Lord of Light faction. Doing this allows us to understand that this legend is really speaking of the time when the alliances of the god factions first formed and then later started breaking down. In the legend of King Arthur, this is represented symbolically as Guinevere first becoming the wife of Arthur, and then later she is said to have fallen in love and began an affair with Lancelot, an affair that rocked the foundations of the kingdom and is said to have begun the destruction of the great and legendary kingdom remembered as Camelot. This is a highly symbolic representation of the different political alliances we've already seen between the 3 different god factions on the cylinder seals and their symbolism. This legend provides us with the additional information that is not available in the dream vision or the Bible. It gives us information that there was originally an alliance between the Lord God faction and the Goddess faction in the very beginning. This allows us to understand that once this alliance started breaking down, the Goddess faction turned to the Lord of Light faction and formed a new political alliance with it, which is symbolically represented by the love affair between Guinevere and Lancelot. Based on this new symbolic understanding, we can realize that this political change could have been the root cause of the original disagreement between all the parties. By realizing the symbolic relationship between the three primary characters of the legend and the political actions of the gods, allows us to take the next step in understanding the additional mystical symbolism contained within the legend of King Arthur. With the most important being the realization that the Round Table of Camelot is a symbolic representation of the great and mighty heaven, the legendary abode of the gods. This allows us to understand that the legendary kingdom of Camelot symbolically represents the rule of the Lord God faction before the collapse of the alliance with the goddess faction and the outbreak of war. This is why there has never been any physical evidence found for the existence of King Arthur, is because that it is an entirely symbolic representation of things that were not of this earth. This then allows us to take the next step and realize that the Knights of the Round Table symbolically represent the mighty archangels that were loyal to the Lord God faction, which according to the oldest legends of King Arthur, number 25, which include Arthur himself. This realization then allows us to begin seeing the symbolic connection to the Book of Revelation and the 24 elders in chapter 4. This allows us to realize that the 24 elders are most likely the different military leaders of the Lord God faction. Within the biblical tradition and many other ancient traditions, these types of individuals are normally referred to as the chief of some number of soldiers. For example, they were normally referred to the chiefs of tens or the chiefs of 20s. This is a common form of ancient military organization that is still visible within modern militaries and their system of rank. Using modern military ranks as an example, these 24 elders would be similar to the idea of being 24 primary generals of the Lord God faction's military forces. One of the final symbolic pieces of this legend of King Arthur is his world-famous sword, Excalibur. At the moment, we will not be going into this particular sword symbolism. However, it is important to point out that we will be referring to this information once we reach the point in the story where this sword symbolism features very prominently. At that point, we'll take a much closer look at its true meaning. Now that we have a slightly better idea of the identity of these 24 elders, we can now move on to the 4 beasts that stood before the throne as described in the Book of Revelations. In order to understand the secret of these 4 mysterious beasts and all the terrible monsters of legend and myth, we must return to the ancient cylinder seals and one very special artifact with our new knowledge of the mystical animal symbolism. We will begin first while looking at the special artifact that you can see here. Then we'll move on to the ancient cylinder seals. This artifact is a stela that is currently located in Paris, France. It was recovered as war booty in Iran in 1899 from the city of Susa. It has traditionally been interpreted as an old Babylonian stela that records a land grant that is dated somewhere around the 12th century BC. But as you will quickly see with your very own eyes, this entire scholarly interpretation of this artifact is completely false. In addition, in the light of our new knowledge of the mystical symbolism, it is also a damningly clear piece of evidence that the scholarly interpretation is a made-up fantasy that is promoted as historical fact. This stela contains a wealth of symbolic information that brings a number of these different symbolic elements together that we've been exploring. We'll begin at the top of the stela and then begin working down from there. At the very top, we can see the 3 familiar symbols of the 3 different god factions. On the left, we can see the crescent moon symbol representing the goddess faction. Just slightly to the right of it, at the top center, we can see the 8-pointed star symbol that represents the Lord God faction. On the right, we can see the solar disk symbol that represents the Lord of Light faction. Directly beneath each of these symbols, we see a temple with a tower-like structure upon each one. Each of these temples represent the primary temple and symbolism of each god that is represented above each temple. Starting on the left, directly below the crescent moon symbol, we see a double temple, each with a dome roof-like structure. Although we have not covered this before, this double arch symbolism is typically seen on many ancient artifacts as a helmet or strange headgear being worn by the shepherd or gods loyal to this faction. It is also associated with the ancient Egyptian god Amun, who was later fused with the sun god Ra, becoming known as Amun-Ra or Uman-Re, and Sobek, the god associated with the Nile crocodile. Unfortunately, there does not appear to be any good interpretation of the exact meaning of this double-arch symbolism, although it is still remembered and used in our modern world. The next temple in the center has a more typical tower-like looking structure that has a ram's head on the top. This ram symbolism should be rather obvious at this point and is a direct symbolic connection to the rams and the sheep spoken of in the dream vision. Uniquely, right in front of this temple, you will notice an odd half fish, half goat-like creature. This is another of the few connections of the Lord God faction to the God or Lord of the Waters in other traditions. This is a symbolic representation of an ocean-going machine that swam like a fish and ran like a goat. In Greek mythology, this is the terrible monster of Poseidon known as Cetus. It is most famously remembered in the mythology of Perseus when Queen Cassiopeia boasted that her daughter Andromeda and her were more beautiful than the sea nymphs. This invoked the horrible wrath of Poseidon, who in turn sent the sea monster Cetus to attack the city of Joppa in Ethiopia. In this myth, Perseus is most famously remembered as using the head of Medusa to turn Cetus into stone in order to save the beautiful Andromeda from being sacrificed to the monster to stop the attack on the city. According to legend, Cetus is commonly described as having the head of a dragon, normally with horns, the front legs of a dog or great beast, a large body like a whale, and a serpent-like tail that was split at the end. Although the monster was a creation of Poseidon and lived in the sea, it was thought to have been amphibious and could also live on land. Additionally, as with the mysterious hunter figure or the twin brothers, this monster had such a huge impact on society at the time that it was immortalized in the stars as the constellation Cetus, the whale. As strange as it may sound, one of the best modern examples of what this machine may have looked like and how it moved through the water, with it ultimately being used as a weapon, is given in the science fiction classic by Jules Verne, 10,000 Leagues Under the Sea, with its description of the submarine Nautilus and its ever-mysterious Captain Nemo. Just as we learned in the last video and the attack on the heaven, followers of the esoteric religion have presented the world with their secret knowledge of these events over the years by interweaving them into popular stories in the same tradition as the ancient scribes. Just as before with the attack on the heaven, or with Enoch being taken away from the generations of the earth, you will never ever be able to put it into the proper context unless you understand the mystical symbolism, or more importantly, the esoteric tradition it originally comes from. The first temple on the right is related to the Lord of Light faction. The symbol on top of the temple is difficult to make out, but it appears to be a harp-like symbol setting upon the head of a spear or sword. This symbolism appears to be telling us that this represents a sound-like weapon that may have sounded like music but could kill like a spear or sword. There are many mythologies, legends, and folklore that speak of a great and powerful sonic-like weapon of the gods. This symbolism appears to be a direct connection with these mystical weapons of sound. It also implies that the Lord of Light faction were the primary ones that deployed and used them. As we continue on with our journey, we will return to this idea when we examine the sword symbolism. Within the esoteric religion, this harp-like symbolism is typically associated with the symbolism of the eagle. In ancient mythology, the eagle is normally connected with and commonly the standard of both Zeus and Jupiter, both of which we now understand are different versions of the great Lord of Light. Over the last couple of hundred years, this harp and eagle symbolism in the esoteric religion has slowly morphed into a much more familiar eagle and flag emblem that is on the right side of the back of the $1 bill. Directly below these temples, we can see 3 rows of similar looking temples with other symbols of objects on top of the temples, with a final grouping of symbols on the very bottom of the stela. For us to properly interpret which of these 3 rows are related to each of the 3 god factions shown at the top, we need to first realize that almost all the ancient cultures normally read from right to left and not left to right as we predominantly do in the Western world today. This allows us to understand that the first row is related to the first God faction on the top right, which in this case is the Lord of Light faction. This is further supported by our new knowledge of ancient Egypt being the original location of the fall of the great Lord of Light and his fellow Watchers. We can also see 3 towers with 3 great beasts beside each of these towers. The bird symbolism in the center is of course linked to the birds of heaven that we've touched upon within the dream vision. The other 2 beasts are just like the half fish, half goat creature from before. They are a symbolic representation of the 2 primary monsters of the Lord of Light faction, which are the 2 terrible monsters remembered in the Book of Revelations as the great red dragon and the 7-headed beast. Again, we will take a closer look at these 2 monsters shortly after we've covered a bit more ground. The next row, or center row, is connected to the Lord God faction. We will take a closer look at this symbolism when we look at the cylinder seals next. The next row down is related to the goddess faction. There are 2 similar temples with what appears to be a sheep and a ram in front of each of them. To the right, we can also see a lamp, a plow, and some additional birds of heaven. At first, the symbolism may seem to be related more to the Lord God faction than the goddess faction, but this mystery begins to disappear once you remember who the shepherds were truly loyal to and that the sheep were given over to the shepherds. In addition, within the dream vision, we were told that the shepherds had gathered together and brought with them all the wild sheep. The lamp symbolically represents a fire-based weapon that was dropped from the air or thrown against the enemy. The birds are, of course, another symbolic representation of the birds of heaven from the dream vision. They're also an indication that there are many details that we are missing and appear to have been lost in the overall story. We will look at the final row in just a few moments, but first we must go much deeper into this symbolism. As we have been learning, the towers we see standing upon each temple is a symbolic representation of the unique power or capabilities that each of these towers possessed. The ancient mythologies about these holy and divine temples of the gods tell us that some were places of sacrifice and worship, while others could heal, some could impart knowledge, and still others had great and terrible powers that could kill, control the weather, and spread plagues across the lands. These different military or weapon-like capabilities of the towers are what the different shaped towers on the temples we see on the stela symbolically represent. The next series of events to unfold in this war are told through the following cylinder seals. As the war progressed, these different weapon capabilities of the towers were then placed onto large mobile platforms or vehicle. The best example might be a modern-day heavy tank or other heavily armored vehicles with a missile launcher or large cannon that was placed upon it. This is the next secret to understanding what the strange creatures of mythology and legend ultimately symbolically represent. Although this might be a bit difficult to accept at first, but this is in fact what you're seeing on this cylinder seal. On this cylinder seal, we can clearly see 2 shepherds placing one of 2 of these towers, which we have seen before, upon the back of one of these mysterious creatures or monsters of legend. We can also see a smaller figure to the right, which represents one of our ancient ancestors who was either a king or priest-like figure, possibly one of the rams. One of the more amazing features of the cylinder seal is that we can clearly see the shepherds using a large 2-tower crane system to place the tower upon the back of this monster. Just to the left of this crane system, next to the shepherd on the left, we can see the symbolism of a fish, which is symbolically connected to the God or Lord of the waters, which we can now understand. This is also the Lord God faction of the Bible. Just above the small human figure, we can see the other less common 6-pointed star symbol representing the heaven just above the Pleiades cluster. Once again, please make special note of the number of stars and the configuration of this cluster on this seal. In our next video, we will explore the true meaning of this small cluster of stars and why it is so important. In this next cylinder seal, we can see the completed monster being proudly displayed in all its glory. On this cylinder seal, we can again see the separation of 3 primary symbols of the god factions, representing the destruction of any alliances that once existed between the 3. Then finally, On the upper right hand side of the crescent moon symbol, we see another configuration of the Pleiades cluster of stars. In our next video, we'll take our next step into understanding the monsters of legend and take a very special look at the secret of the Pleiades cluster of stars. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos.